This is mainly Europe and the Mediterranean from prehistoric to about the 17th century, with a few wider Eurasian notes because composite bows and the earliest guns are broader than Western Europe alone. Range weaponry did not progress in one clean straight line, from bow to crossbow to guns. Bows, crossbows, and early firearms overlapped for centuries, and for much of that overlap, the biggest difference were less about raw range than about rate of fire, training burden, ability to hold aim, and the shift from muscle power to gunpowder. The bow is the oldest of the three. Britannica describes the bow and arrow are prehistoric, as a primary military weapon in the Mediterranean world and the Europe from antiquity through the Middle Ages. Within that very long history, the main bow families were the self bow made from a single stave, the powerful English longbow, and the composite recurve bow associated with the Asian and steppe mounted archery. The longbow was the dominant English missile weapon in the Hundred Years' War and into the 16th century. Britannica describes it as commonly about 6 feet tall, usually of yew, with cloth yard arrows and an effective range of roughly 140 to 300 meters maximum. The crossbow is a much older globally than medieval Europe, but its classic battlefield career in Europe is later. The MET's crossbow catalog places the earliest reliable documentary and archaeological evidence in China in the mid-first millennium BCE. In Europe, crossbows were in the use by the 10th and 11th centuries, and by the High Middle Ages, they were one of the most important hand missile weapons. They remained major military arms until the late 15th century to the mid-16th century, when firearms began to displace them on the battlefield, though they lasted much longer in hunting and target shooting. Firearms arrived in Europe in the 1320s. The Metropolitan Crossbow study that the first firearms appeared almost simultaneously in places as far apart as Italy and England during that decade. The basic sequence runs from hand cannons, also known as handgun, to matchlock harquebuses, or otherwise known as arquebus, in the 15th century to the larger musket in the 16th century, while ignition systems evolved from matchlock to wheel lock around 1515 and then to flintlock, known by the mid-16th century and widespread in infantry muskets later. Main families. For bows, the three most useful categories are self-bows, longbows, and composite bows. A self-bow is the simplest idea, one stave bent by a string. Longbows are a textbook case, being made from a single piece of yew using the junction of heartwood and sapwood, with suggested draw weight between 65 and 175 pounds, and a peak around 110 pounds. Composite bows use several materials. Britannica describes the classic form as wood stiffened with horn and strengthened with glued-on sinew, and that they were especially effective in mounted warfare because they packed high power into a shorter bow. Crossbows range from relatively simple stirrup span weapons to heavy arbalests requiring belt hooks, hand cranks, windlasses, or quenecons. Britannica describes the classic medieval crossbow as a short bow fixed transversely on a stock, with a groove for the bolt, a sear, and a trigger. Later steel bows and mechanical spanning gear greatly increased power. There were also great crossbows and springolds for siege use, as well as later hunting and target crossbows. Some sporting crossbows shot ordinary bolts, while lighter stone or pellet crossbows fired stones or clay pellets so that fur would not be damaged. Early firearms also break into a few clear families. First came the hand cannon or handgun, essentially a metal tube, sometimes on a stick, ignited by hand at the touch hole. Then came the matchlock harquebus, which Britannica calls the first gun fired from the shoulder. The musket was a larger, heavier shoulder firearm that evolved from the harquebus in the 16th century Spain, and early muskets were often fired from a rest. On the lock side, matchlocks used the burning match, held in a serpentine wheel. Wheel locks used sparks from a pyrit or flint against a spinning wheel, and flintlocks used flint striking steel and were simpler and cheaper than wheel locks. Parts. A bow, at its simplest, is just a stave and string. On surviving English war bows, you can add horn nocks at the ends, and some museum bows preserve a characteristic D-shaped U-stave. A crossbow adds a great deal more hardware. The Metropolitan diagram lists the major parts as the bow, nocks, bowstrings, tiller or stock, forend, lock area, stirrups or spanning ring, bolt rest, nut, bolt clip, rear sight, and trigger. A firearm distills down to the classic formula: lock, stock, and barrel. But on a matchlock, you also need the serpentine, priming pan, and the touch hole or port that carries the flame to the main charge. Surviving guns also show accessories like ramrods and barrel plugs, arrowheads, bolt heads, and bullets. An arrow is the easiest to describe. Britannica defines it as a thin shaft with a feathered tail and a notch at the rear to fit the string, plus a hard head at the front. Evidence shows some useful specifics. Tudor war arrows were usually popular, roughly 677 to 880 millimeter long. Their flights were made from goose or swan feathers. A bolt or quarrel is the same basic idea, but a shorter and stouter. Surviving crossbow ammunition shows iron heads secured to shafts by tangs. Better quality target bolts could add sleeves or butt plates. War bolts were often stored in quantity, sometimes with the heads and shafts kept separately until needed. Historical arrowheads and bolt heads were specialized tools. The most famous split is between bodkin points, and broadheads. A historical metallurgy study describes slender bodkins as intended to penetrate mail, while broadheads were meant to cause heavy wounding to large animals and to horses on the battlefield. The Mary Rose assemblage also shows barbed iron heads that would have been difficult to remove. Bolt heads often tended toward pyramid-shaped and strongly pointed forms. In the MET material, the smallest examples likely belong to arrows, medium ones to ordinary crossbow bolts, and the largest to crate crossbows or springled bolts. Firearm projectiles changed just as much. By the early modern period, though, the usual small-arm projectile was the lead ball. The battlefield's thrust guidance defines so-called bullet broadly to include ball, slug, case shot, and hail shot, and notes that lead or lead composite round shot was also used in artillery before larger ordnance shifted increasingly towards cast iron in the 16th century. Usage and effectiveness. The bow's great advantages were that it was cheap, light, and fast. The Metropolitan crossbow catalog says self-bows could be produced cheaply, and that an experienced soldier might release about 12 shots a minute. The price of that speed was the training. The same source stresses that proficiency required years of practice with the progressively stronger bows, and the power of the shot was still limited by the archer's own strength. In practical terms, that made the longbow devastating in trained hands and especially powerful in massed volleys, but much harder to replace quickly than later gun troops. The crossbow was the great mechanical equalizer. It was heavier, more complex, and slower than a self-bow, but the user did not need years of shoulder training and back conditioning to exploit a powerful weapon. Because the string was held by a lock, the shooter could keep it spanned and aim without the trembling problem that affects a drawn handbow. The usual trade was speed for control. The Metropolitan gives roughly 1 to 4 bolts a minute for a crossbow against much faster discharge of a practiced bowman. In open battle, the longbow could dominate through range and volume. Fitzwilliam notes 5 or 6 arrows for every bolt from a heavy crossbow. but the crossbow remained excellent from cover, parapets, ships, siege lines, and cramped interiors, and Britannica notes bolts could pierce mail. Early firearms were not instantly superior in every aspect. The Metropolitan explicitly says the first guns were simply in construction, but difficult to make, expensive, cumbersome to use, and slow enough that preparing a shot took at least as long as spanning a crossbow. But gunpowder changed the game because projectile power was no longer fundamentally limited by human muscle. Britannica describes the early musket as throwing 2-ounce ball about 175 yards with little accuracy, while later muskets became lighter and more practical. The long-term result was that, as locks improved, firearms increasingly displaced crossbows. In war, even though bows and crossbows remained useful in some specialist roles. Cost, manufacturing, and maintaining. The MET says self-bows could be produced cheaply. Crossbows were more expensive than self-bows because of more complex stocks, locks, metalwork, and spanning devices, though still affordable to broad parts of the population. Early firearms were initially expensive and cumbersome, and gunpowder itself was costly. Much of bow and crossbow maintenance can be inferred from their materials. Evidence is found preserved hemp or linen bowstrings and horn knocks, while composite and crossbows construction could involve wood, horn, sinew, glue, hemp, leather, and staghorn. That means moisture, damaged strings, and failed glue joints were real practical problems, especially for composite weapons. Firearms shifts the maintenance problem rather than removing it. Matchlocks had to keep the barrel, powder, and ignition system functioning, and surviving guns still preserve barrel plugs used to keep the dirt and debris out when not in use. As a closure, if you reduce the whole story to first principles, the bow was the cheapest, lightest, and fastest system, but the hardest to master. The crossbow was slower and more mechanical, but easier to exploit fully and excellent from cover or in siege conditions. The early firearm was initially awkward and expensive, but it freed projectile power from the user's muscles and eventually became the dominant battlefield solution. None of them was simply better. In all ways, each was the answer to a different balance of training, cost, logistics, rate of fire, and tactical need.